All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've got the show back on the road sooner than what I had promised you. So we will continue with this conversation. As highlighted, we are looking at the theme regarding a shift in commercial office as well as occupier demand, and using both East and West Africa as case studies for us to refer to. As mentioned earlier, Nena Alinta, who's the head of CRE services for Brawl Property Group in Nigeria, will be leading this conversation, and she'll be in conversation with Patrick Katabua, who is the SADC Accounts Director for Occupier Services at Brawl Property Group, as well as Moses Lutala, who joins us as the Country Manager for Brawl in Uganda. Please warmly welcome them on stage. This is an interactive panel discussion session, so at any time if you have any key questions, feel free to raise your hands and they will be addressed. Ladies and gentlemen, please warmly welcome our panel on stage.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and sorry for the slight delay. We have our panelists here now. My name is Nena Alinta. I'm the head of corporate real estate services at Brawl, Nigeria. I'm also overseeing the occupier services group across West Africa. And our discussion today really is focused around occupiers and their demand and how there's been, a shift in demand globally as well as in our region, and what landlords are doing to meet that demand, and what types of products and buildings are being developed in our different countries. I think we have a diverse panel here. Myself will be talking mainly on the Lagos, Nigerian market, and I'll let Moses as well as Patrick introduce themselves briefly. We'll give a brief overview of the markets that we're going to be covering, and then we'll dive into the discussions around really what's driving occupier demand and how their demands are being met. So I'll hand it over to Moses to introduce himself.
Thank you, Nena. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Moses Lutalo. I work with Brawl Property Group, Country Manager Uganda. I'll be specifically discussing East Africa, more particularly Uganda, and touch some bit of Kenya. Thank you.
Thanks, Nena. Patrick Katabwa, and I will be speaking a bit more on Francophone Africa, and we'll be using DRC and Ivory Coast as case studies.
Very high-level overview of our real estate markets in the countries that we're discussing, and then get into the meat of the discussion around the demand drivers. So I think it's no secret that Nigeria has recovered from a recession. However, the real estate sector is still lagging. We're still showing negative growth in the real estate services sector. We've seen declining rents over the last 2-3 years. Rental levels have declined from highs of $1,000 per square meter, and we're seeing asking rents at about $700 to $800 a square meter now, which have been pretty stable over the last 6 months. However, what we're seeing is a continued gap in terms of what's actually achievable and where net effective rents are falling. So for asking rents that fall between the $700 to $800 per square meter, we're seeing net effective rents or achievable rents closer to $500, $550, maybe $600 per square meter per annum. So in the market, the very difficult landscape and market that we're in, the landlords are really, struggling and doing their best to attract tenants. And by doing, offering more incentives in terms of cash payments, tenant improvement allowances, rent-free periods, et cetera, and actually being a little more flexible in trying to attract as many tenants as they can into their buildings. On the vacancy side, we have very, very high vacancy rates. If you're looking at the prime grade sector, the A grade class of assets, and you're looking at the key commercial areas in Lagos, so Ikoyi and Victoria Island. Ikoyi has vacancy rate, average vacancy rates of about 80%, and Victoria Island about 70%, which should tell you really what pressure the landlords are under to try and make sure that their buildings are fully tenanted. We're seeing that the more successful landlords are the ones that are more flexible, and I think this leads into our discussion really around what's driving tenant demand and what types of efficiencies are they looking at when they want to make decisions for their portfolio, their real estate portfolio. As I mentioned, rents continue to decline, high vacancy rates, a lot of supply in the grade A building sector or segment of the office market. So we have about 150,000 square meters of prime grade office space in Lagos, and about another 35,000 square meters or so coming up in the next 6 months. If you look at the total sort of office supply or stock, it's about 500,000 square meters of space, which, we talk a lot about there being an oversupply in the Lagos market, but that's just, less than half of what is being supplied in the Kenyan market. So I think, obviously, there are a lot of headwinds, and developers are focused, most of their efforts and most of their developments have been supplied in the prime grade sector, and there's been a very shallow pool of tenants to take up the space there. So in a nutshell, that's sort of what's going on in the Lagos market, and I'll let them talk about their markets, and then we can get into the demand drivers.
Yes, specifically talking about Uganda, the commercial office space market has gone through quite challenging times, but we think the rents have gotten to a level where they can't go any further than that. You're looking at your grade A office space, asking rates are anything between $16 to $18 a square meter. Grade B, anything between $12 to $14 a square meter. You notice that a lot of the demand we're getting is out of the prime grade office space, which you don't have so much in supply. We've noticed most of the big occupiers who come looking for your grade A office space are becoming more and more interested in more sophisticated locations that offer better access from a connectivity point of view, and these are not very many properties available. So you find that within the grade A office space, we have quite high occupancy rates. You don't have any sort of voids within the grade A space. Most of the pressure is on the grade B office space, where you have probably what I would call substandard properties that do not meet the requirements of your multinational occupiers. And this has kind of put a lot of pressure to the landlords who are playing within that space. So you find that whereas there's been talk of sort of an oversupply within the commercial office space market in Kampala, it's more to do with the grade B space, where you have a lot more voids than what you'd have in your grade A. In fact, if I can specifically speak, we don't have more than 4 commercial grade A properties in Kampala. So in terms of opportunities, that is one space that would probably encourage investors to play in. In terms of the Nairobi market, we all know that that market is being overly supplied right now. You have a lot of institutional investors who have put up huge towers, and they're doing occupancy rates of 40, 50%. So that's quite a bit of pressure on the landlords, and the returns and chasing good returns. So in terms of the yields that we're looking at for Kampala, anything between 8 to 9%, your grade office space, you're able to get that. We're seeing a lot of sophisticated occupiers trying to get out of the CBD. They're looking for more occupier sort of build-to-suit solutions, and they're looking out for investors who can put together these products. I think that's for the East African market.
Yeah, I'm going to start off with the Kinshasa market. Going back to Martin Davies' presentation on Thursday, where he said you've got Africa Light, you've got Africa Heavy, and then you've got DRC, which is basically a black hole where you're not really sure what exactly is happening. But you look at Kinshasa from an office supply perspective, it's been quite limited in terms of quality stock. However, the penetration of occupiers have increased quite a bit. You look at Vodacom, you look at Celtel, Orange, all these are global entities, and they've all expanded their presence in Kinshasa. Citibank is there, Stanbic is there, but what is interesting is that none of them really occupy or dominate A-grade office stock due to limited supply. So by default, these occupiers actually go for villas. You'll get a 400 or 500 square meter villa. You are the single occupant, meaning that you can provide your own electricity, you've got ample parking for your staff, you can man entrance and exit, you've got your own branding, so it gives you some form of control of your real estate. And because the occupiers were traditionally defaulting to these villas, the developers were also quite reluctant to go and build A-grade. And Kinshasa is the type of market where you will not get pre-lets until you've got a complete stock, because the occupier wants to look and feel and walk into the premises before committing into a lease agreement. So because of these legacy issues, there's been very limited supply. So I think there's still quite a good demand for it. If there's quality stock that comes onto the market, there'll probably be fair take-up. Abidjan is probably, I would say, 3-4 years ahead of Kinshasa, in the sense that we are now seeing corporate entities actually putting pressure on landlords to build A-grade stock, and are able to commit that there will be take-up once they build buildings that do meet some of their international norms or some of the international standards. From a rental perspective, I mean, in Kinshasa, you're looking at anything between $30 to $40 a square meter. And because the majority of those buildings are financed by cash and not by loans, the landlords are willing to stand and wait until they do find tenants that will actually take up at those rental levels. So rentals have been fairly steady. I don't think that they will be coming down in the near future. In Abidjan, you do have some form of A-grade offerings, and the vacancy rates in A-grade is very, very limited. As soon as an A-grade building comes up, it basically gets taken up. And the rentals there are anything between 25 to 28 euros per month. And those rentals have been stable, but I think they will probably start coming down a little bit because there is talk of new A-grade and mixed-use developments coming onto the market.
All right, so I guess the main topic of the discussion is around what types of buildings are being developed in the markets and how they are meeting the demand profile of occupiers. And I think each of our markets is very different. Nigeria seems to be a little further ahead in terms of just the supply of grade A space than Kinshasa and Abidjan and even Uganda, where some of those markets still seem to be landlord-led markets, and Nigeria is now a very tenant-friendly market, and that wasn't the case, 5 to 10 years ago. So I think one of the things that I have noticed, at least in our market, is that real estate strategy for a lot of multinationals is being driven from a global perspective. And so, when corporates look at efficiency and look at ways to optimize their portfolio and to reduce costs, they're not just looking at, the quality of the buildings that you are building and the efficiency of it in terms of, okay, let's ensure that they're raised floors so that we can, we're a little more efficient in terms of our headcount ratio or employee to space ratio. They're also looking at flexibilities in terms of the way that you structure leases. And I think this has been a long process to educate some landlords and developers in terms of understanding what's really driving the demand from occupiers. So yes, your building needs to be efficient. Yes, we need to focus on energy efficiency and all the technology solutions that we find in smarter buildings. Those are all important, but it's also important to ensure that you're able to provide a building that matches a tenant's demand profile or headcount projections over a 5 or 10 year period. And we're starting to see the emergence of and growth in the co-working space globally. So occupiers are demanding is, I want to be able to grow my portfolio. I want to be able to take on space without the capital investment. I want to be able to take it for a limited amount of time, and I want to be able to shrink when I don't need that requirement anymore. And so where we're seeing some of the more successful landlords in Lagos are understanding that efficiency also includes, or smart buildings is not just about bricks and mortar, it's also about structuring your leases in a way that the global, the multinationals feel comfortable about flexibility over their lease term. They're starting to offer some of those, flexible lease options, so break options, expansion rights, the ability to hand back space. But what would be nice would be to also see maybe some solutions within grade A office space where you have co-working solutions within that building so that the multinationals can then grow and contract as they need to do. And then the other point is that in Lagos, we've seen so much focus on the prime grade market and the prime grade stock and sector, where there has been no focus on the grade B market, which is where I think a lot of demand is. And I think that the investors have found it, or developers have found it very hard to make their returns. And so in trying to sort of crack that, that puzzle and try to figure out how to meet some of these reduced rentals and still provide an offering that will give them returns, we're starting to see developers thinking more about brownfield redevelopment, so redeveloping existing buildings. We haven't seen a lot of that happen over the last 2 years, but I think going forward, we've started to have discussions with developers where that's sort of going to be their strategy, not really focusing just on the A-grade market anymore. So just interested in hearing your perspective in terms of smart building and being more efficient. Are developers in your different markets thinking along those lines, and how well are they meeting the occupier demand?
If you look at East Africa generally, it's not any different from what is happening in West Africa. The occupiers coming out strong and making all these sorts of standards that they would expect from potential offices that they want to occupy. And more than often, most of the developers, say in Uganda, are yet to start appreciate this sort of concept. They still think your typical design should be driven by the architect with no input almost from the occupiers. So you find that they're becoming less and less interested in playing in that space, because I think the cost of construction is going to go up if you're doing an energy efficient building, a green rated building. So you find that most of the business cases around the developments they're putting out there are based on the traditional model where you're just putting up a shell and core building, and you expect tenants to come in and do the full fit out, which is long gone. I mean, most of the tenants that are coming into the market, even the big occupiers, want to find the right floor plates, buildings that are finished to a certain level. You have the ceilings in, the air conditioning in. So we're trying to get to educate the landlords that actually you can still make a good return if you're to structure your building design and your expectations around what the tenant would want. And you find that we do not have many buildings that meet that, even those that are being constructed. I mean, we have in excess of about 60 square meters, 60,000 square meters coming into the market in the next 2 years. But if I go through all that, I don't see anything that is going to meet your future building in terms of green ratings, collaborative workspaces, agile, sort of environment. So there's quite a lot of gap in that space within the Ugandan market, and we think as especially the oil and gas sector is going to play a very critical role in dictating the future developments in Kampala, because you see what companies like Total, E&P, the likes of Halliburton, Baker Hughes, are all looking out for developers who can work with them and deliver a tailor-made sort of solution for their requirements, both within the CBD but also where the oil fields are. So we're getting challenges trying to convince the landlords, but I think when you get more sophisticated financing coming into place, it will be much easier to sell that sort of concept to the developers, especially where, I mean, we've been working with ratios, say for parking, of 2 bays per 100 square meters. And now your multinational is asking for 4 bays per 100 square meters. So that significantly changes your parking requirement. You have to go probably more basements into the ground, and most of the developers are not seeing the viability. So those that are, risk averse are trying to hold back and say, guys, let's see what's going to happen. So I can say it's not any different from the expectations from the rest of the world. It's just that we do not have the landlords or the developers who are willing to match that sort of requirement, at least within the short to medium to short term.
A quick question, are there any regional or international developers in the Ugandan market?
Well, we've got guys like Eris have come around and they're looking for projects. I think the likes of Actis are looking actively for projects. We have quite a number of guys coming from Nairobi as well, trying to look. Your typical insurance companies are playing quite well within the real estate space. The old Mutuals of this world, Britam. So most of the big players within the Nairobi market are also looking into Uganda. Some even already have presence there. But also you'll notice that some of the occupiers are now getting to acquiring their own premises. I mean, companies like Britam have bought premise, they bought a building. Sanlam, I'm told they're looking for a property to acquire. So it will be a mix between those who are buying their own properties, but increasingly, I think in order to kind of liberate cash flows and optimize the balance sheets, they would want to, as much as possible, not hold real estate on their balance sheet.
Yeah, I think for the Kinshasa market, it's still a very landlord-dominant market. So in terms of creating flexibility for the occupier, it really depends on the size of their pocket as well. Then you can flex up or down. Because the vacancy rates are quite low, the developers are comfortable to receive rent at a certain price. And the question is, why should I create flexibility for you if there's another tenant who's able to take the space at the same rent that I'm providing to you? So that's sort of the approach that the landlords have at this point in time. And also because the vacancy rates are very low. It's still a build it and they'll come market. So the guys who have been able to introduce A-grade stock to the market have been quite fortunate, and they've been able to get it let quite quickly. And because of these dynamics, the possibility of introducing flexibility in your leases and stuff are quite limited. And from an agile co-working type concept principle, it's still to pick up in the DRC. Due to power and internet challenges, it becomes a bit difficult to work remotely from the office. So once that stabilizes, we'll probably then start seeing the co-working, agile collaboration type initiatives being brought into the market. For Abidjan, because there's a bit more sophisticated capital going into that market and you have a bit more sophisticated developers, we are starting to see serviced offices being brought onto the market. And they also don't last very long. As soon as a serviced office is brought into the market and it has quality finishes, it gets taken up very quickly. So in Abidjan, we do have that flexibility of creating opportunities for our occupiers.
And from my understanding, there's a mix of grade B and grade A space also in the Abidjan market, so it's not just a focus on the prime grade.
Yeah. What's interesting with Abidjan is grade B and grade C stock is basically fully taken up, primarily by government and parastatals. Your A grade is left for local private companies or your multinationals. And it's in your A grade stock that you actually have a bit of vacancies.
So we've heard a lot about the growth in the Francophone countries in the market and focus of some of the developers, given the challenges and the headwinds in Ghana and Nigeria. Have you seen a lot of growth in the office market in Abidjan? And have you seen a lot of the international developers come into the market, or are they still exploring?
Yeah, so with Abidjan, it's quite interesting because not only do you have your typical, what you would call your big African developers, like your Actors, your R&B, Westport, who have been scouting that landscape, but you now have well-established Moroccan, Lebanese, and French developers who are also coming into the Abidjan market. But even then, I think the development rate is not as fast as the occupiers would like it to be. As of last year, we placed more than a dozen occupiers still in villas because there was not sufficient quality stock that met the requirements. So I think Abidjan is a place to look out for, where there's probably space for another 15, 20,000 square meters that can come up with immediate take-up within the next year and a half, just based on occupiers moving from villas into corporate offices.
Just to keep this interactive, are there any questions from the audience?
Hi, I just wanted to clarify, you talk about A-grade offices, and in South Africa we also talk about P-grade. Perhaps you can just elaborate further on what your reference is so we understand what you're talking about.
Okay. Unfortunately, there's no grading system really in the Nigerian market, and we tend to use the terms prime grade and A grade interchangeably. I think when we talk about, and I think buildings, any international sort of quality building is called an A-grade building in Nigeria, but I think occupiers have really started to, they're a little more discerning, and they've started to segment the market. So we're seeing that there is an emerging P-grade market outside of sort of the B plus and A-grade market. So on the prime grade side of things, you find buildings that have raised floors. You have buildings that might have building management systems, that might have other mixed-use elements within them. The parking ratios are, a lot more generous than some of the other buildings. You have international standards in terms of the facilities management and the property management, etc. And then you also have a lot of the blue chip tenants, and they're in the prime areas in Lagos. So without having a grading system, I think there are 2 or 3 buildings that are considered prime in Lagos, and I think everything else sort of falls under that. And the prime grade buildings in Lagos are really the ones that are more successful in terms of take-up. So you find that, in Ikoyi, if we're saying the average vacancy is about 80%, you might find that the average vacancy in those buildings might be 40% or 35%, and that's because, as rental values or rental rates are falling, corporates are more demanding in terms of what they're looking for, and their international global standards are really what they're requiring in those markets.
You talked about smart buildings, but perhaps you can just talk a bit about sustainability and how that, what the occupiers are looking for on that respect. So, there's quite a push towards Green Star rating or Green Star across East Africa as well. But maybe from a West Africa point of view in Lagos and other places, perhaps you can talk further about that. And what exactly, because we talk about multinationals, I'm sure they're coming with a lead or some requirement in that respect, but maybe you could just talk about further about what they're looking for.
In all honesty, given that I think in the Nigerian market particularly, we haven't seen a huge push towards green buildings. I think most of the multinationals are more concerned about, one, having the buildings meet their just basic HSE standards and be, meet their requirements just from their global portfolio standpoint. But for us, sustainability, or for corporates in the market, sustainability has really been driven by reduced energy costs. So when you look at, there are probably about 2 LEED certified buildings in Lagos. One of them is Heritage Place that was developed by Actors. And a lot of their certification, or a lot of their push is around energy conservation. And so tenants are, more intrigued by how they can reduce costs. So from that perspective, yes, there's a push towards green buildings, but not really, for most of the transactions that I've done, it's a nice to have. It's not a need to have. And that's how it sort of is within the market. So I'm not sure if it's a driver for the multinationals in the Nigerian market.
Yeah, maybe just to add on to that, there's always an aspiration, whether you're in Francophone or even in Zambia, the majority of our occupiers aspire to be in a Green Star building or some form of LEED rated building. But once they look at the cost to bring those buildings to a level where it can actually be rated versus moving into the building without it having a rating, that cost differentiator sometimes is quite large, and they decide to just settle for what is available. But it's definitely an aspiration, and if there are developers who are able to create the stock where you can have the rating and the differentiator on the rental is not that large, there would certainly be take-up.
And just to add also, I think there hasn't been a lot of analysis in our region in terms of what benefits a green building really provides a corporate. So they are intrigued when you say, okay, there will be a reduction in your energy costs. But outside of that, there's really no hard, tangible data to show them, this is really what you should be looking at and why you should be looking at green buildings.
Thank you. I have a question towards the tenants or the occupiers. You said that more and more solutions like shared offices or co-working solutions would benefit your markets. My question is, how is that accepted in your markets? Because for what I know, and my experience in Mozambique has been that the companies that actually operate shared offices don't offer much to the landlord in terms of fixed rents. They come with solutions that are revenue-based. So how is that accepted in your markets?
So I think that's why there's such a huge gap, and there's no provision in your A-grade buildings. You rarely find the co-working, the global co-working or regional co-working service providers in Nigeria. Most of the co-working service providers are using converted residential and are attracting demand from sort of startups and tech companies. The multinationals you haven't had that kind of provision in a lot of the A-grade space. And I think the reason why that hasn't really developed is just, so sort of what you're saying, that the co-working space providers are looking at a revenue share model, and the landlords are just not interested in that conversation. And so unless the landlords start to see that this is actually a benefit for them because that's what the occupiers are demanding, I don't think that conversation will move forward for further than where it is. And I think there just seems to be a gap right now that isn't being filled.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask a very similar question. So is there a business case for entrepreneurs to take long leases from landlords and turn spaces into co-working and serviced offices, or whatever serviced offices are there in the respective countries? There's more of a landlord's own effort towards getting better returns.
I definitely think there's a business case because it's becoming more and more of a trend, at least in the Lagos market, where the multinationals we're talking to are asking questions around, okay, can you talk to the landlord about getting a co-working or serviced office provider within this building because they want to sign a lease there. And instead of looking at taking 2,000 square meters of space or 1,000 square meters of space, they'd rather take 600 and then guarantee the service provider, at least 8 months, a year of X number of desks that they would pay for, because they just don't want to hold on to that. So I do see a business case. I'm not sure how deep that demand is, but I'm definitely have heard that as a demand driver for quite a few corporates in the last year.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that observation. And why would an occupier look for serviced offices for starters, right? They're looking for flexibility. At this point in time, you look at Abidjan or Kinshasa, they do not have that flexibility, and they're looking for that flexibility, which allows them to take up additional space as they grow or reduce their space if the business shrinks. And with serviced offices, they actually sign much shorter contracts, which allows them to really flex up and down. And that's the type of flexibility that a service office would provide versus entering into a conventional lease.
Yeah, maybe for East Africa, companies like Regas, ESBC have done quite some stuff in that space, but specifically for Uganda, the traction hasn't been that much. And yet you'd think out of the serviced offices then come the collaborative workspaces and all that. So I think, and it's been more of the pricing point. You'd find that your Regas sort of office space is kind of expensive. Usually most of the guys are in there for maybe 6 months, 1 year, and you want to go out in your premises. So there could be a niche within just not to the level of Regas, but if someone can come in and play at a relatively, affordable sort of proposition, you'd get, guys coming in, because all the startup companies are looking for solutions like that, but they cannot afford your Regas, they can't afford your ESPC sort of pricing point or Sunbird. So for Kampala specifically, I think some landlords actually looking into that. They've already started working out costings to see if they can furnish maybe 1,000 square meters. What sort of returns are they looking at? And this is because especially the grade B is getting a lot more vacancies in the long term.
And I was going to add also, some of the corporates within Lagos who have their own office space, so they've built their space and they occupy it and have vacancies within it, are looking more at those types of innovative solutions where they can actually, instead of renting to subleasing to a tenant that wants the space for 3 to 5 years, they look at putting a serviced office provider within their vacant space, so that if they do need that space in the near future, then they can take it on and they can actually pay the rate for it. So there definitely is a business case. I'm just not sure what the demand is and how deep that business case is. Any other questions? Should we give you back some time?
I have a question. It has to do with co-working in Dar es Salaam. What is your experience? How deep is the market? Or is it the same experience that you're getting in Kampala, that you need grade B, not grade A spaces?
Yeah, interestingly, Dar es Salaam is doing quite well. If you look at the performance of Regas, it's really great in Dar es Salaam, partly because you have an influx of, the traffic is a lot more from an international perspective in Dar es Salaam. So the centers there are doing a lot more, and you find more and more opening up. Because if you see how many centers Regas has in Kampala vis-a-vis Dar es Salaam, there's quite a huge, the demand is high that side, and I think most of it is being driven by your multinationals that are coming in, which is not the case in Uganda. But yes, Dar es Salaam is doing quite well. And if we look at the performance of the different centers, from what I've heard, Regas are very proud of their business in Dar es Salaam. It's doing quite well.
Okay, if there are no other questions, I think we'll end our panel early. Thank you so much.